Time is wasting, said Basin, interrupting Lahan's brother before he could give them his name. It was practically a running gag by now. They would have to be careful it didn't overstay its welcome. The farmer had spoken of a shrine, but it didn't quite look like the shrines Maomao was used to. It was made of brick, and there were no windows. Inside hung a cloth, and in place of a statue there was a painting of the gods on the wall. Beside the shrine was a shack, seemingly the house the villager had mentioned. All right, here goes nothing, said Lahan's brother, who still didn't look like he thought this was a good idea. He knocked on the door, then he waited. There was no response. Maybe he's out. Do you think he's at work? I'm sure he has to take care of some sheep or his field or something. It was almost lunchtime though, so hopefully he would be back soon. Just then, a low, raspy voice came from behind them. Can I help you? Maomao and the others turned to find an older man with tanned skin standing there. He had a hoe in his hands and a cloth wrapped around his neck. He looked like the very picture of a farmer. His clothes were patched in places and streaked with dark soil. Yes, he was a farmer all right. But Basin's hand immediately went to his sword and he settled into a fighting stance. Maomao saw why. Hey now, what do you think you're doing? Are you going to assault a simple farmer? The man's tanned skin was covered with discolorations, some from age and others from long hours spent under the blazing sun. Those were not what had startled Basin, however. No, it was the man's missing left eye. The cavity yawned in his face, the eyeball simply absent. His right hand, wrapped around the hoe, was missing its pointer finger. His exposed skin was covered with scars from swords and arrows. Maomao saw why the villager had seemed so intimidated, and why Basin had reacted instinctively. This man had the air not of a farmer but of a soldier. Have you been in the military, sir? Basin asked, careful to sound polite. Nothing as fancy as that. I was just a locust making trouble in the plains. Locust, a striking choice of words. And there was something else that nagged at Maomao. Have you been working in the fields? She asked before she could stop herself. There was the hoe in his hands and the mud on his shirt. She recognized the stains. What else do you think I'd be doing? The man asked, although he didn't sound particularly bothered. Maomao's question had indeed seemed obvious, but there was something that had dawned on her as she looked at the village fields. I just didn't think one normally got quite so dirty doing field work. You wouldn't get this filthy even tending the wheat, not at this time of year. The dust of the fields was dry. So long as one didn't go out of one's way to use damp earth, it shouldn't have stuck like this. Tell me, did a man named Rikusen come this way? Are you friends of his? The farmer blinked at them with his one eye, then opened the door to his shed. Come on inside. I can offer you goat's milk at least. He leaned his hoe against the wall and ushered them in. The old man was indeed Nyanjan, and his house was as plain inside as it was outside. It is a lot like my house, actually, Maomao thought, picturing her shack in the pleasure quarter. Nyanjan had a hearth, a cot, and a very modest table. That was about it aside from farm implements. His house seemed to be dedicated to farming much the way Maomao's was to medicine. Judging by this room, he looks like a pretty simple man. Those scars all over his body, though, didn't seem like the marks of a man who'd made his living as an honest farmer. There were 3 chairs inside. Nyanjan let the guests sit while he stayed standing and poured goat's milk into chipped teacups. The duck pecked at the dirt floor. Some grain must have spilled there. You are right, a man named Rikusen did come through here. It would have been about 10 days ago. That was just a day before Maomao and the others met him in the western capital. Do you know what he was here for? Maomao asked. She had originally planned to let Basin or Lahan's brother do the talking, but since she had brought up Rikusen, she would handle this conversation. What he was here for? He just grabbed a hoe and helped me plough. Plough? You mean to get ready for the spring planting? Wheat could be grown in 2 seasons. Seeds planted in winter could be harvested in spring or early summer, while seeds planted in spring could be harvested in autumn. No, I do need to do the spring planting, but that wasn't what this was about. Nyanjan put the goat's milk on the table and slid the cups toward Maomao and the others. Basin looked like he wasn't too sure about this unfamiliar drink, but Maomao was grateful for the opportunity to wet her throat. It was normal goat's milk. It was lukewarm, but there wasn't anything strange in it. It might sound a little overblown, but I had him help me with the ritual. Ritual? Maomao asked. Basin and Lahan's brother exchanged a look. They were as confused as she was. You mean some sort of ceremony to pray for a good harvest? More like to prevent a bad one. I'm sorry. This is all a little difficult for me to follow. Do you think you could explain more thoroughly? In response, Nyanjan sat on the bed. His tongue stuck out of his mouth. His manners were less than refined. Are you all willing to listen to an old man prattle for a bit? The villagers certainly aren't. Listen, sir, we don't have much time to spare, Basin said, growing annoyed. Oh, well, pardon me. Nyanjan lay down and rolled over on the cot. Maomao got to her feet, holding up a hand to stop Basin. Sir, I'm sorry, please tell us what you have to say. She bowed her head. Apologies were free after all. If he was going to get upset about this, she might as well say sorry. HRRM, I don't know, Nyanjan said. It might have sounded playful from someone else, but from him it came off as sadistic. I don't think I feel like it anymore. You watch your attitude. Basin was about to surge forward, but Maomao stopped him again. Lahan's brother, unused to conflict, had become a bystander. I know he's hit-headed, but I wish he would stop picking fights. She knew Basin's strength, and highly doubted an old man would stand a chance against him. But who knows? Sometimes these stubborn old men turn out to be tougher than you'd think. Maybe Basin could best the old man physically, but what if he simply refused to admit defeat and clammed up? That would be bad for us. She had a feeling that Nyanjan was just being stubborn. He'd let them into his house when they'd mentioned Rikusen. She suspected there was actually something he wanted to get off his chest. What can we do to get you to talk to us? Maomao said, as humble as she could be. HRM. Well, how about a little guessing game, sir? What exactly are we supposed to guess? Simple. What I used to be, yeah, simple, if only I knew what he meant. Basin and Lahan's brother were still looking at each other. The duck did what Basin couldn't and pecked at the old man's feet. All right, I'll take a shot, Basin said, but Nyanjan waved his hand with too few fingers. I'm not asking you, kid. I'm talking to the girl there. Kid, Basin forced himself to keep it together. To an old, heavily scarred man like this, he really was nothing but a young whippersnapper. So only Maomao had the right to answer. The question became, what should she say? Nyanjan, it's a good, strong name. It meant to intuit the truth. I hope he's as honest as his name suggests, and that everything he's told us is true, she thought, reviewing in her mind what he had said. Nyanjan had called himself a locust, not a favourable bug for a farmer, so he savages crops. Nyanjan lacked his pointer finger as well as his left eye. You don't usually get hurt that bad as a farmer. But he says he has never been in the army. He must have been in at least some kind of battle. Several, judging by the extent of his injuries. Without his finger, he wouldn't be able to use a weapon, especially a bow. Maomao found herself thinking about the bandits who had attacked them the day before. They and their broken arms were probably in the hands of the authorities by now. There were only a couple of outcomes for robbers like them. Hanging, for one. The best they could hope for was mutilation. Then she remembered Nyanjan saying that Rikusen had helped him with a ceremony of some kind. Nyanjan, she said. Yeah, his attitude defied her to guess. Lahan's brother was looking at Maomao with what seemed to be indignation, not that it mattered to her. Maybe he didn't like that she already knew this random old guy's name even though they had met just a few minutes earlier. That wasn't the problem right now. Maomao took in a breath and let the words out in a rush. Were you a human sacrifice, sir? Everyone froze. What kind of answer is that? Basin demanded. You don't know the expression. It is when someone is sacrificed while still alive. Of course I know that. What I do not know is why you think it has anything to do with this old man. He is obviously still alive. Proper sacrifices tended to end up dead. Maomao, however, stood by her answer. She said he did not ask why, only what. She looked at Nyanjan, who showed none of Basin's disbelief or annoyance. Instead, he looked somehow satisfied. Yes, he said, I see. A sacrifice, maybe that is what I was. Nyanjan let out a long breath and narrowed his single remaining eye. Would the three of you be so kind as to listen to the ramblings of a foolish old man? His tone was light, but there was deep emotion in his eye. If you would be so kind as to let us, Maomao replied. This time Basin and Lahan's brother, mindful not to upset Nyanjan again, bowed their heads respectfully. Chapter 8, An Old Man's Ramblings. It was over 50 years ago now, and there were twice as many nomads as there are today. Perhaps even more. I was one of them, born into a tribe that was, well, you might say more warlike than many of the others. Being martial-minded sounds good, but truthfully we were little more than brigands. We mostly raised livestock. However, if one of us wanted a wife, he would go to a neighbouring tribe or a settled village and simply take one. Theft and even the selling of people were just ordinary side businesses for us. Oh, don't give me that look. I know it was wrong. But at the time I didn't question it. I thought that was how life worked. My grandfather had done it and his father before him. My grandmother and mother were both abducted women. It all seemed perfectly natural to me, but I know better than anyone just how bad it was. Moving on. I was a young man then, just in my teens. Even the chieftain trusted my bow arm. He always wanted me in raiding parties. I knew that if we won our battles, we ate good food and got more things. If the losers didn't like it, well, it was their own fault for letting us beat them. It was an easy pride to muster when you've never tasted defeat yourself. That pride spread until it had infected the entire tribe. Then one day the chieftain's son said he wanted a windreader girl. The windreader tribe was something like priests, I guess. They were entrusted with rituals for everyone on the plains. They moved about the land, raising birds and reading the wind. They had a lot of very intelligent people in that tribe. They could tell you what the weather would be each year, and they were never wrong. There were a lot of hard people among our clans, violent people even, but there was an unspoken understanding no one touched the windreader tribe, until we broke that rule. We attacked the windreader tribe to get a wife for our future chief. The windreaders were right in the middle of one of their rituals, hardly a bow or sword among them. What did they have? Strange things indeed. It seems the ritual involved domesticated birds and hoes. The women followed the birds around while the men worked the ground with their hoes. Funny stuff, right? But that was the ritual, I guess. I remember the chieftain's boy laughing. He sneered they looked like a bunch of farmers. And then he said fire. I remember how my bow creaked just before I let my arrow loose. The way it twanged, the arc the arrow took. The thwack as it found its mark in one of the windreaders' heads. That was the signal to attack. They were defenseless as babes. They had no weapons, they were just working the earth. It took no skill to kill them. It was as easy as cornering an injured deer. The pillaging that took place that day was the worst I had ever seen in my life, although it didn't sink in until later. We didn't hesitate to kill those who served us as priests. That actually made everything worse. Perhaps it was the fear of killing them, the fear that if any of them survived, they might tell the gods what we had done. We killed all the grown men and the older women as well. We left only the young women alive. We sold the youngest children into slavery, and the tribe's birds became our dinner. It's a sickening story, isn't it? But we did it. It was even exciting in a way. That is why we didn't notice it then. Even during the looting, one particularly stupid bird kept pecking at the ground. I remember seeing him, but I simply speared the creature. Only later did I learn he might have been the only thing standing between us and disaster. After that, we let our appetites run even wilder than before. The chieftain's son took the windreader girl against her will, and she became pregnant. About the time she bore her second child, the catastrophe arrived. There was a great dark shadow over the whole plain, like a smear of charcoal against the sky. At first we thought it was an unseasonable rainstorm. Then we heard what seemed like a ringing in our ears. The livestock were restless. The children clung to us in fear, and the women held them close. One man rode off on his horse to investigate. He was soon back, almost fleeing toward us. His clothes were in tatters, and so was his hair, even his skin. His horse was near mad with fright. It was a job to calm her down. She looked like she'd been bitten by something. We asked the man if he'd been attacked. Looks like you already have a pretty good idea of what he found, but let an old man spell it out for you. The villagers don't believe this story at all. They say there hasn't been anything that size around here for decades. Anyway, the scout didn't have to tell us what he'd found, because a moment later it found us. Bugs. There were bugs all over our camp, more than you could count. Grasshoppers formed a black cloud that attacked our tents. The beating of their wings was deafening. Worse than the sound of the wings was the sound of them chewing. The sheep grazing in the fields ran off, terrified, and the dogs howled like beasts possessed. The men swung their swords wildly, but what could they do to bat the insects out of the sky? We tried swinging torches instead, but it couldn't have been a worse idea. Burning grasshoppers crawled all over everything and everyone, and the tragedy only got worse. I started stomping on the insects on the ground. It was the only thing I could think of to do. None of them were bigger than a couple of thumbs, yet it felt like we were in the belly of a giant grasshopper. The women tried to hide in the tents, but the bugs got in through the cracks. I could hear the children crying inside. I could hear their mothers screaming. They didn't even stop to comfort their kids. They heaped abuse on their husbands, on the men who couldn't protect their own families from the insects. These were women who had been snatched away from their own homes to be brides, and now they let out everything they had been storing up until that moment. The grass wasn't enough for the creatures. They set upon our food stores as well. They ate wheat, beans, and vegetables, but they even went for our dried meat. They chewed holes in our tents. When they finally left, the only things in their wake were people exhausted from screaming and countless dead grasshoppers. They had eaten everything, and our livestock had run away. We somehow managed to find a horse, and we headed to a village to try to procure some kind of food. We knew we were just bandits to them, so we tried to pick someone they wouldn't recognize, but it wasn't enough. They shot him as soon as he got close. We never dreamed they would shoot someone without first trying to find out who he was. We ran. He couldn't keep up with us, but we ran just the same. I remember him reaching out to us, begging for help, but there was nothing we could do for him. We just left him there. I looked back once. The villagers had dragged our friend and his horse into the village. I guess we should have known. It wasn't as if we were the only ones ravaged and left starving by the grasshoppers. I just prayed that the man we'd abandoned didn't suffer before he died. It's funny, right? Prayer from the ones who had murdered their priests. We had nothing else to eat, so we killed the few animals we had left. We made soup trying to fill it out with some grasses, but all we did was make ourselves sick. Some of the children were so hungry they began eating the grasshoppers on the ground. Then one of them died. Perhaps the grasshoppers were poisonous, or maybe they ate them without removing the legs first. I do not know. They wasted away from lack of nutrition, and then they started dying as they grew too weak to continue. Then there were the pregnant women. They needed twice as much nutrition as the rest of us, so of course they also grew weak. Their bodies wasted, but their bellies kept getting bigger. The wife of the next chieftain was like that. There was no food for her after the tragedy. Her first child clung to her, sucking its thumb to try to distract itself from the hunger. You won't be surprised to hear that the second child was stillborn. The death of his child nearly broke the chieftain's son. He suffered another blow when his wife died soon after the birth. With the last of her strength, she said, "You people desecrated the ritual, and now there are no more windreaders to perform the offices for you. The insects will menace the people of the plains for the rest of time." She must have held those words inside her for years, ever since we killed her people and abducted her. She laughed joyfully and died, holding her withered child to her wasted body. People began to agree with what she had said. We were the cause of this disaster for interrupting the ritual observance. Everyone on the plains saw us as their enemies. I'm not going to pretend we didn't deserve it, but we still wanted to survive. We ate grass, we ate bugs, we killed and were killed, and we kept fleeing. One starving man resorted to eating the flesh of his dead friend. When that wasn't enough, he started trying to kill the living for food. I lost my left eye to an arrow shot by someone who wanted to eat me. I pulled it straight back out and shot him in return. I didn't want to eat or be eaten, so I ran away. There was nothing to run to, though. I found myself starving, my throat parched. Unable to bear the hunger any longer, I followed the smell of congee into a city. They were having a food distribution thanks to the local governor. The congee they handed out was tasteless sludge, hardly fit for livestock, but to me it was the most wonderful thing I had ever eaten. I was still snotty and weeping when the guards arrested me. It seems someone in town recognized me from an act of banditry. I didn't resist. I was through fighting. I just hoped they would feed me in prison. The thought of a few square meals before I was hanged brought joy to my heart. I never did get to be hanged. Instead, as punishment, they cut off my finger so I could never use a bow again. Then they made me a farmer. To this day, I think they let me off lightly, considering what I did. The governor, as it turned out, knew about the windreaders and their ceremony. They were allowed to continue with the mysterious ritual for their food because they were under the governor's protection. We may not know what the ritual meant, I was told, but it did mean something. What was it? Who was this governor? He is gone now with the rest of the Yi clan, as I am sure you know. This was back before that upstart Jayukyuan made his name. The Yi clan knew about the windreaders' ceremony. That is why they scattered us across the land as serfs to replace the windreaders. Sadly, all a serf can do is work the land. The Yi did not know what the windreaders were doing with their birds, and anyway, chickens were about all we had around. So we continued with the ritual, but in an incomplete form. So you are right. I was allowed to live purely so the ritual would live on. I am a human sacrifice that they happened to call a serf. This village was founded by sacrifices like me. We built that shrine in memory of the windreaders we killed. I paid with my life, a small price compared to murdering our priests and bringing disaster upon us. I am sure no one who paid attention to us would believe the trade was worth it. That all takes us up to 17 years ago. When the Yi clan was wiped out, the farmers disappeared to wherever they liked. A few fools, men who had always been the rough kind, went back to banditry. Ah, I know that look. You have met a few highwaymen yourself. Who knows, maybe I would recognize them if I saw them. You want to know why I stayed here? Simple, because I never want to have grasshoppers tearing at me again. No, never again. All right, that's enough rambling. Got any questions for me? Chapter 9 Rite and Ritual. Nyanjan took a mouthful of lukewarm goat's milk to wet his parched throat. Maomao, Basin and Lahan's brother waited in silence. I did not expect to get so much information out of him, Maomao thought. She would have to try to sort through all he had told them. She crossed her arms. So more than 50 years ago, Nyanjan and his tribe had destroyed the Windreaders, and several years after that, a major insect plague had occurred.